Hello and welcome. My name is Sean Ulmer. I'm Executive Director at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. I want to thank you for joining me for another episode of our One Night Stand series. This is a series of monthly Zoom programs where we look at one work by one artist for one night. And then these recordings are uploaded to our YouTube channel, and we have several one night stands on there. So if there's one that you missed or you want to do some more exploring, I direct you to our YouTube channel. Just when you get onto YouTube, type in Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, you should see all of our programming there, both our series of one night stands as well as our quarterly series of Grant Wood in Focus presentations, as well as other things that we produced many moons ago during the pandemic. So thank you again for joining me this evening. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, I think you should be able to see my screen at this point. Tonight we're going to be looking at Ulfert Wilke's 14th of July, 1980, which dates from 1980. And this is, let's see if I gotta start my slideshow, excuse me. Here we go, there we are, much better. And here's an image of the piece in question. This is the work that you can see currently on view at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. It's part of a current temporary exhibition that we have up this summer called Thinking Big, large-scale works from the collection. And our curator, Julia Jessen, has pulled together several large-scale works for presentation in our larger of our two temporary exhibition spaces. And this is probably one of the larger, if not largest piece in the exhibition when you consider all three parts together. And it really is a stunning piece. It does, not surprisingly, take up a lot of space and storage. So we love getting it out and getting it up on the wall and giving it some breathing space, along with some of our other larger pieces in this particular exhibition. And it is an exhibition along with its companion exhibition, Tiny Wonders, that investigates scale. So this summer at the museum, we're looking at scale. In one exhibition, we're focusing on large-scale works where they kind of fill your entire field of view, and is a very different effect when artists work on a very large scale. And in the other exhibition, Tiny Wonders, these are a series of works produced by artists who are working on a very, very small scale, an intimate scale, that requires you to focus very, very carefully on smaller works of art that nonetheless have very, very significant impact, visual impact. So both exhibitions do look at visual impact, but from two different sides of the scale spectrum. So this is a wonderful work by Ulfert Wilke. We happen to be blessed to have a number of works by Wilke in the collection. Not surprising because he spent some of his time here in our area, and he was fairly widely collected by the people in our community. And most of, over 95% of the museum's collection, it comes from donations from local individuals. And so it's not surprising that a fair number of works by Wilke have ended up in our collection. About a dozen or so, 14 of them, something like that. I'm going to focus on this one. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Wilke, a little bit about his biography. I have a sort of an early photograph of him here. Wilke was born in Bavaria, Germany, and immigrated to in 1907, and immigrated to the United States in 1938. So, at the age of 31, still a young man. He's known especially for his large canvas paintings and some of his lithographs, which I'll be sharing with you in a moment, that were inspired by calligraphic writing. He was very much intrigued by the written language, and much of his work is derived from his abstract interpretations of shapes, colors, and so forth in writings. He studied at Harvard on a Carnegie Scholarship before being drafted into the United States Army in 1942. In 1947, he completes his master degree in art at the University of Iowa. And throughout the 40s and 50s, he served as an art teacher and a director at several universities and museums. He received the Guggenheim Fellowship twice, both in 1959 and 1960, which allowed him to first travel to Munich and Rome, and then later in Kyoto, Japan, where he lived in a monastery and studied Japanese calligraphy with the monks. In the 60s, when he returned to the United States, he lived in New York City, worked for a time as a professor at Rutgers. He was in 1968, as his reputation as an art collector, because he was collecting all through this period, his reputation as an art collector earned him his position as the founding director of the University of Iowa Museum of Art, the UIMA, that is now known as the Stanley Museum of Art. And he served as museum director there for 10 years, the founding director there for 10 years, before relocating to Hawaii in 1978. And he was very, very widely shown throughout his career up until his death in 1987. And here, more mature work of him by local photographer Joan Liefringsug-Beret. Here he is seen in front of one of his works, one of his larger works. But it's an interesting trajectory throughout his career. And it's interesting to take a moment and try to figure out where the 14th of July fits in to that career. Early on, when he was beginning his career as a very young artist here, still in his 20s, he is doing modernistic, slightly abstracted work, such as what you see here, very much influenced by European models. At this point, he's still in Europe. He hasn't emigrated to the United States yet. That's to come in another 6 years. He's looking around at a lot of the modern art movements of the early part of the 20th century, and he's very influenced by them. It's still very recognizable subject matter, a cityscape here, but you can see that there's a little bit of fracturing going on, a little bit of layering and piling up, the kinds of things that might have been slightly influenced by the likes of someone like Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque and their Cubist approach to representation. Not fully Cubist by any means, not like what Picasso and Braque were doing, but very much sort of thinking about planes, intersecting planes, and how really cityscapes are made up of a series of these intersecting planes. So this seems quite a far cry from the 14th of July, 1980, and indeed it is. And it is a progression on the part of the artist to that point. Here, another work of unknown date. I'm not sure exactly when it formed, but again, you can see there's a simplification of forms. These domestic structures are all very geometrically conceived. We do have a very dramatic sky in the background, a couple of figures in the foreground, but it's a very simplified form, something that might have been influenced by a Vlaminck or another artist from the early 20th century. Still, I think early in Wilke's career. Still very much influenced by the European schools. But then by 1961, you see he takes those forms and he distills them even further. So I'm going to go back one. So these wonderful angles that you see in this with this domestic architecture, these peaks, these triangles, these forms get distilled even further. And flattened even further in this fairly unusual lacquer on canvas, but larger scale work from 1961. Palettes gotten very dark, and the forms have been greatly simplified. And you can see here the beginnings or the hints of his interest in calligraphy. It's not fully realized in a work like this, but you can see that how, as he distills these forms to these basic shapes and lines, where they become, or start to become looking like something that's calligraphically inspired, something that looks like lettering or language in that work. And so then by 1967, he's taking it all the way into this wonderful overall pattern that you see here in a work in this ink on paper, not big but not small, work on paper, where it is very much like calligraphy. Now he's already at this point done both of his Guggenheim fellowships. He's been back to Europe. He's been to Japan. He's already fully immersed at this point in his interest in calligraphy. And you can see it made manifest in the work, in this very simple work of black ink on white paper. And here from the same year, he's very much doing the same thing, but he's beginning to introduce color. So the core, the spine of it, if you will, is this black ink on paper, but then he's gone in selectively and applied orange gouache to spaces that are formed by this very arbitrary calligraphy. It's not a specific calligraphy. It's not a calligraphy of a particular language. It's really made up. But there are strong associations with a wide variety of different Eastern and Middle Eastern calligraphies. But here he's elevated it to an art form and has filled in that space in between with pigment, in this case with gouache. And then he doesn't always do his calligraphy in black on white. Here he's using black to outline calligraphic forms and then filling them in with red acrylic paint. Again, on paper, and it's a very different feel when the lettering is red versus when it is black. So here he's merging the color and the calligraphy, as opposed to the last example where the color surrounded the calligraphy. And then in 1977, he is working in this example, a work from our own collection. He is working in lithography. So he's using printmaking technique to transfer these ideas that he's been mostly exploring in ink on paper or acrylic on paper into a lithograph. And here, again, there's the calligraphic form with a little bit of pigmentation between some of those characters, really creating this wonderfully abstracted form that is calligraphic in feel. I mean, it feels like lettering, but it's not saying anything. It's not specifically saying anything. And then filling in with this color, which sort of takes it to, which gives it a certain level of depth and form. It almost starts to become three-dimensional in some ways on a two-dimensional surface. Here from the same year, and a not so great slide, another work. And again, this is where you see calligraphy and color, and you can see that there's much more color filling in. So he hasn't abandoned in any way the use of the color. I mean, he's not transferring the color to the lettering. He's still using color to fill. He's exploring all of these things at the same time, is what I want to say. And so, so you can see here, he's using some color to fill in that space between the letters, but it feels less like it's filling in between the letters and serving more as a ground upon which the lettering sits. So because he's using much more color in a work such as this one, it feels like that he's giving it a background and then the lettering hovers on top of it with a few gaps and spaces. And if you look over to the right-hand side, he's actually used that coloring to create one calligraphic element there. So he's kind of going flipping back and forth in this particular composition, where the color was sort of more of a somewhat of a minor player before. Here it takes a much more major role in the composition itself. And then there's calligraphy that takes over the entire field of view. So not a huge work, 18 by 13, again from the 70s, but here it's all over, corner to corner calligraphy, what appears to be kind of black on black. But actually, and I think I have a detail, when you look more closely at it, and I hope it appears, it's the calligraphy itself, while it is primarily black, it has an undertone of it, a kind of purplish red undertone to the calligraphy, which distinguishes itself from the flat black background. So in the previous one where we saw red used as a kind of background that comes right up to and very close to the calligraphic elements and serving as a background, here the whole background is filled in with the flat black. And then the calligraphy kind of vibrates against that, not only from the white border around it, but also from the fact that the calligraphy itself actually has a very subtle color to it, a subtle kind of red-purple undertone to it, which I hope you can see in this detail. And here another lithograph from the same year where he is exploring side by side in one lithograph. He's exploring how it looks to have white calligraphic on black background, where he's using a solid color background. So there's none of this sort of fill in between. He's just using the whole background as a solid plane of color, and then contrasting it, if you will, the exact same composition, exact same calligraphic elements, but in black on this kind of tan background, which is also printed. So it's all one print. These two fields exist side by side with a small white margin in between. And you can see how differently these two sides feel, act, and react to each other just simply by changing the colors. It's almost as if the black calligraphic letters of the left have been lifted off and placed on a tan background on the right. And this wonderful relationship develops between the two sides of this print. Here from 1967, Black Tulip, which is an informative title. You can see that he's going bigger. This is a 48 by 48 inch piece, and it is an oil on canvas. And here he's not filling it with densely packed calligraphic elements. Instead, he's really stripped it away. He's made each of the calligraphic elements larger, bigger, fatter, and putting it against this ground. So it really takes on a much more emphatic statement. It's less busy, but in some ways it's even more powerful in its punch, and it forces you at a large scale to really kind of focus on those calligraphic elements. And here from a couple years later, another large canvas, 48 by 72 inches. You can see, again, there's fewer calligraphic elements, but he's reintroducing, if you will, color as an important element. Some of the calligraphic elements are colored themselves. Others are black. And then he's filling in between some of these calligraphic elements with these two colors, and then reserving the majority of it for the white background. So again, sort of going on a larger scale, fewer calligraphic elements here, introducing, or kind of, if you will, reintroducing color into the composition. It's not like he abandoned it. I don't mean to imply that, but he's kind of gone from a black and white in the previous example to one where there's where he's introduced color into it, and that leads kind of in the next year to a work such as this one. This is another work that is owned by the Museum of Art in Cedar Rapids here. And it is also on view. It's part of a different exhibition. Even though it is a large-scale work, it was already employed in an exhibition called Roy G. Biv, Rainbow of Art, which looks at art, at the impact of color in artwork. And this is on one of the walls. And you can see here, he's distilled the calligraphic elements to these very simple geometric shapes. He's outlined them, if you will, with in white. The red elements, they'll also have a small, tiny outline of black as well around them, and they kind of hover on this surface. All of it feels very, very flat and very much in the picture plane. But it's a very, very powerful piece. It's got good size. It's almost 6 feet tall by 4 feet wide. It really has a great visual punch, a very great visual impact. And you can kind of see where he's been moving in the previous examples to work such as this. And then he's also working on a smaller scale still. He's not abandoning smaller scale. And he's also exploring in ink, he's also exploring adding watercolor. And we've seen him work in gouache before, which is another water-soluble pigment. But here he is watering down the watercolor so that there are areas that are dense and other areas that are quite pale. And he's integrating these calligraphic forms that he's drawing with ink, and then filling in with watercolor in between those spaces, and then also sort of kind of going outside of that. So outside the calligraphy, color is expanding beyond. It's no longer being contained by the calligraphy, but it is mostly in this case being contained, but it is beginning to sort of merge outside in a work like this. And as you see here in another work owned by the museum, much of the same sort of thing, a smaller piece, ink and watercolor on paper, where he's got the calligraphy down and then he's working the colors in. And you can see in both of these examples where he's utilizing the watercolor, oftentimes it is with a strong, dense color in the center, and then it fades to either side. So if you look, for example, at the blue box or the purple box, you can see that it's very saturated color in the center, and then it's pale along the edges of that block. And it almost looks like a cutout. It almost looks like something he's collaged and placed in there because it has a completely different relationship to the calligraphy than we've seen before. And so these are coloristic elements that stand on their own in conjunction with the calligraphy. There are areas still that are contained by the calligraphy, but these other color elements are standing on their own. And you see in this example, he also adds color to the top and the bottom of the sheet, of the paper sheet. Here, another example, black ribbons, another watercolor and ink on paper. Again, a combination of color applied that's contained by calligraphy and then color that sort of exists on its own as an additional element. And this, a little bit later than the last example I showed you, and this is from 1980, which is a significant year for this presentation because that's the same year that he created the 14th of July, 1980, which is a very large work, which again, I think you can see where it comes from in the previous examples that I've shown you. So you've got a large calligraphic element, a kind of a simplified form. There are areas of color that are contained by the calligraphy. And then there are areas of color that stand on their own. There's less graduated or graded color. You can see that each color block is oftentimes made up of multiple colors. It's not a single color that's lighter on both sides, but you can see, except in the case of a couple of the blue areas, But you can see where this is coming from. It really fits in this great evolution of his exploration, and he's added on the top and the bottom of the central panel colors, additional colors, and you can see it on the top and the bottom of the right panel, and on the bottom of the left panel, and the top of the left panel is a calligraphic element. And just so so you get a sense, these are large works. I failed to share with you to mention the central panel alone is 70 inches high by 94 inches wide. This is a big painting. This is a big painting. It's a triptych. These are all meant to be shown together. Here in this slide, I've kind of pieced it together. And so it's not, exactly the experience that you would receive in the gallery, where it's a little more seamless than I did here. But that's a very large piece. The side panels alone are 64 inches high by 44 inches wide. So 5.5 feet tall by 4.5 feet wide, or a little bit more, are the side panels alone. And then there's the large central panel. Now, he doesn't stop there. So here from 1981, I want to show you, I want to bookend this piece with a few other works. So here, in a watercolor and ink from 1981, the following year, you can see that there is less, in this particular example, there is less calligraphic elements. They're still there. You still recognize them as such, especially if you know his work. But then these color blocks become more prevalent. They are almost flag-like. They look like flags or pennants. In a composition such as this, he's taking these color blocks like we saw in 14th of July, 1980, and making them really the primary element in a composition like this. You can see that he's also, applied color to the top and the bottom of the sheet here, and so he's really kind of exploring, and he does also collages. At the same time, he's doing collages, some of which employ flag stamps that you could put into a book of flags or something like that. So you can see where he's deriving some of his imagery source, but that kind of piling up of color blocks, of different color blocks, leads to this work, or I should say leads to, but it is akin to this work, which is also from 1980. This one's called the 11th of January, 1980. And this is also in our collection. And you can see where he's piling up these colors, these shapes, one on top of the other. And I need to correct myself here. I made a mistake. I was just noticing, I got distracted doing so, that is actually dated 1985. I happened to glance down at the signature, and it clearly says 1985 on there. It says 85. And I was just double checking my list of works in the collection, and it is indeed the 11th of January, 1985, not 1980. So my mistake there. I'm going to go back so you can see where a work like this from 1981, with this sort of layering up of color blocks and fields and stuff, leads to a piling up of these here. Much less prevalent is the calligraphic element that we've seen in his work, beginning really in the 60s. He's investigating something, very different here in his evolution. This from 1985 is just a couple of years before he passes away in 1987. And so, you can see where he's evolving. And go back a little bit. He's also looking here at a work from 1981. I wanted to include this as a simple little, really felt tip pen, also in our collection of a quote Viking ship drawing. And you can see it's just simple lines and simple forms. So this is a very different kind of composition. So in these 80s, in this last few years of his life, he's investigating a wide variety of images. He's taking some things to their natural conclusion, but he's also investigating new things, such as you see here in this Viking ship, or here in this fish compote, a completely different and unexpected work by him late in his career from 1983. And here, again, almost going all the way back to his representational work that he was doing early on in his career, a bit abstracted, but his sense of line is pervasive throughout this piece and throughout his entire career. And I wanted to share this because it kind of shows some of the work that he's doing later in his career. And then the 11th of January, 1985, is probably the latest work that we have in the collection. It kind of shows where he's taken a lot of his interests throughout his career. But here again is the piece in question. It is, as I said, a large piece. You can see the dimensions up there as well. But we were kind of curious that how he arrived at this title, the 14th of July, 1980. It's a very specific title. A lot of his works have interesting titles and they're informative titles. And we really don't know much about this. Of course, 14th of July, and one of the reasons I picked this piece, not only do I like this piece very much, but as we sit here on the 16th of July, I thought how appropriate to pick for the one night stand on the 16th of July, a work called the 14th of July, having just passed this last Sunday. It is Bastille Day in France, but that does not seem to have played a factor in this work at all. There's nothing in here that really speaks to Bastille Day in France. Perhaps there's more symbolism with the fact that his birthday was the 14th of July. That was the day that he was born. And our curator, Julia Jessen, did a little bit of digging, and she discovered that there's another work called the 14th of July. It's called the 14th of July, 1970. And it is in the collection of the South Dakota Art Museum, South Dakota State University. And she found that in their commentary on their piece, which is this one, which looks very much like that period where he was doing these calligraphic characters against a dark background. She discovered that in their write-up on this particular piece, they state, quote, July 14th was Wilke's birthday as well as Bastille Day, and that date became the title each year of what he considered his most successful painting of the year. So that's our only source for that. If it bears truth, then he has created each year a work called the 14th of July, differentiating it each year by the year that comes after it. And so that would mean that our 14th of July, 1980, would be the piece that he considered to be his most successful piece in 1980. And so don't have anything to corroborate that, but it certainly is a possible explanation. No doubt South Dakota Art Museum is informed by something specific. And so I imagine they probably got that information either directly from the artist or from his gallery or something like that. So that is one possible explanation for that title. But he also, and here again, it's misstated, he also created work like this called the 11th of January, 1985, in the year 1985. And so he was not immune from naming other pieces by other dates on the calendar. I don't know if the 11th of January was symbolic for him at all or not. But the mere existence of another piece that is titled by its date, I think is interesting in and of itself. And it may undermine the argument that 14th of July it was his best work of the year. It may very well be the case, these things can coexist at the same time, but he may also have applied a date as to when the work was completed, or something of that sort. Who knows? But this one is the 11th of January, 1985. And just, I failed to mention before, underneath these flat forms, all of these flat forms, these wonderful shapes and colors that he has there, he has this line drawing, a line drawing that's not too far away from the Viking ship drawing that I shared with you. So it's almost like that's underneath it, and then he's piling all of this stuff on top of it. And these look like they could be any number of abstracted forms representing different things. And so it's hard to tell. And the title, 11th of January, 1985, does not give us any clues as to what we might be looking at, what the reference in the natural world might be. Here's the piece again, as you will encounter it in the museum if you come visit it. It really is a stunning piece. Not only are the colors rich and vibrant, but the sheer scale of the work is really, really quite impressive and overwhelming, visually overwhelming in a good way. I believe I've put in here a couple of slides from not the current show, but a previous show that we did on the work of Ulfert Wilke, drawn almost exclusively from our own collection. So this is a show from several years ago, and I'm showing it to you simply so you get a sense of scale. So these are some of the other pieces that I've shared with you in this one night stand. And you can see how dramatically larger the 14th of July, 1980 is from even something like Proofreader's Mark, which is a fairly large painting in and of itself, but that you see on the end wall there, or from the other direction where you see some of these small watercolors on paper. You can see how much bigger the 14th of July is. Opposite that, you see the 11th of January, 1985. And it's a decently sized work, but it is so almost dwarfed by the 14th of July. And here, a little bit better view, I think, of it. You can see some of those lithographs that I shared with you earlier in the presentation on the end wall. They're very powerful, really big, visually big works in and of themselves, but when you put them in a gallery setting like this next to something as big as the 14th of July, 1980, you can see they really, they're still powerful, but they are dwarfed in scale, which is why a piece like the 14th of July, 1980 is a perfect piece to include in an exhibition about large scale work, because it really does fill your complete field of view, and it really does sort of really knock you out of your socks. It's really a spectacular piece. Well, thank you for joining me this evening. I hope you learned a little something about Ulfert Wilke and the 14th of July, 1980. And I encourage you to come check out the piece in person, as well as look at proof readers' marks in an adjacent gallery. Two wonderful examples that give you some insight into this really, really phenomenal artist who is not so widely well known today, but deserves to be better known than he is. So do tune in next month for a new edition of A One Night Stand. And if I don't see you in the museum, I will see you there. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Have a good evening.